Hey there, and welcome back to the Hacker News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories that got the community talking. We reviewed 29 stories that hit the front page, and wow, did we see some fascinating tensions emerge. From Google's soft censorship of tech journalism to debates about whether innovation is worth sacrificing simplicity, all the way to philosophical questions about what it means to prove we're human in an increasingly automated world. We've got 5 stories that really captured the community's attention yesterday, and they paint an interesting picture of where tech is heading, and maybe more importantly, where we're not sure we want it to go. So, let's jump right in. Story 1, the best YouTube downloaders, and how Google silenced the press. All right, shifting gears here, let's talk about the best YouTube downloaders and how Google silenced the press. This one really struck a nerve in the community, with over 500 points and 230 comments, and honestly, it's easy to see why. So here's the deal. This article isn't just about which YouTube downloader to use, though it does give recommendations. What's really fascinating is the author pulling back the curtain on something that's been an open secret in tech journalism for years. Basically, tech publications won't write about YouTube downloaders because they're terrified of losing their Google ad revenue. The author straight up admits that when they worked at How To Geek, the attitude was, "We can't write about this, we'll get in trouble." Think about that for a second. Google doesn't need to explicitly censor anyone. They've created this perfect system where publications self-censor because they know where their bread is buttered. It's like, imagine if your landlord also paid your salary and you wanted to write an article about tenant rights. You'd probably think twice, right? Now, the article makes this pretty bold claim that I found interesting. It suggests Google secretly wants YouTube downloaders to exist because they help videos go viral. The author argues that when people download and share clips, it actually benefits YouTube's ecosystem. But here's where the Hacker News community really pushed back, and I think they make a compelling case. One user, Multicrystal, basically demolished this theory with technical evidence. They pointed out that if you look at the actual code of YTDLP, which is one of the main downloading tools, it's this massive complex beast of a program. We're talking about thousands of lines of code dedicated just to defeating Google's anti-download measures. The developers have to constantly update it because Google keeps changing their APIs, adding new obfuscation techniques. It's this never-ending cat-and-mouse game. If Google wanted these tools to exist, why would they make it so incredibly difficult to maintain them? As for the actual tools the article recommends, for most people, they suggest Stature, which is free open source and has a nice graphical interface that works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. For the command line folks, YTDLP is the gold standard. The community also brought up alternatives like Seal for Android, SmartTube for Android TV, and Tubular, which is actually a modified YouTube client. What really resonated in the discussion, though, was this underlying anxiety about preservation. Multiple users talked about how YouTube videos just disappear, sometimes without warning. One person mentioned they're considering building a personal archive of everything they watch, just in case. It's this digital equivalent of, you know how your parents might have kept VHS recordings of their favorite shows? Same energy, but for YouTube content. There's also this interesting tension around the ethics here. YouTube's terms of service technically prohibit downloading, but the article calls these terms toothless, comparing them to those EULAs that nobody reads. And let's be honest, who hasn't used a YouTube downloader at some point? Maybe you wanted to watch something on a plane or save it to Twirdle for offline reference. The technical folks in the comments got pretty deep into the weeds about how these downloaders actually work. Apparently, YouTube uses something called cipher signatures and constantly rotates their methods of serving video. The YTDLP team has to reverse engineer these changes, sometimes multiple times per week. One commenter pointed out that maintaining YTDLP is basically a full-time job for multiple developers, all working for free just to keep up with Google's changes.
What I find most troubling about this whole situation isn't the downloaders themselves, it's this idea that Google can effectively control what tech media writes about without any formal censorship mechanism. They've created this environment where publications know certain topics are off limits, not because of any explicit rule, but because they can't afford to bite the hand that feeds them. The author of this piece can only write freely about it because they've already been, as they put it, fired from the internet. They're not dependent on Google's ad money anymore. And you know what's wild? Some commenter suggested that Google might actually be loosening up on this lately. One person mentioned that How To Geek, the same publication the author says wouldn't touch this topic, recently published articles about YouTube downloaders. So maybe things are changing, or maybe Google's just picking their battles differently now. The whole thing really makes you think about the concentration of power in tech, doesn't it? When one company controls both the platform and the primary way media companies make money, they get to shape the conversation without ever having to explicitly tell anyone what they can or can't say. It's elegant in a deeply uncomfortable way. And speaking of uncomfortable relationships with big tech and proving ourselves to machines, I'm Not a Robot is trending on Hacker News with over 350 points, and folks, this one's a ride. Neil.fun has created this interactive experience that starts out like your typical CAPTCHA test, but quickly spirals into absolute madness. So you know how we all hate those click all the traffic lights tests? Well, Neil has taken that concept and turned it into 48 levels of increasingly absurd challenges that supposedly prove you're human. And I mean absurd. We're talking about having to make specific facial expressions at your webcam, identifying obscure Minecraft items, playing Where's Waldo, and somehow drawing perfect shapes with your mouse or, God forbid, your finger on a touchscreen. The Hacker News community is having a heyday with this one. Some people are genuinely impressed by Neil's creativity, and honestly, the production value here is pretty incredible. Each level feels polished and intentional, even when it's asking you to do something completely ridiculous. But here's where it gets interesting. A bunch of users are so frustrated with certain levels that they're literally sharing JavaScript cheat codes in the comments. Level 39, the facial emotion recognition one, apparently it's breaking people. Multiple users posted code snippets to just bypass it entirely.
And that brings us to what user Blixt pointed out, which I think is brilliant. By the end of this thing, it's actually easier to write a bot to solve these challenges than to do them as a human. Like, think about that for a second. The whole point of CAPTCHAs is to prove you're not a bot, but Neil's created this perfect satire where the most human response is to automate your way through it. There's something deeply ironic about people posting JavaScript solutions to automatically click through a test designed to prove they're human. One user even shared a one-liner that just speeds through multiple levels. It's like we've come full circle. The humans are acting like bots to prove they're not bots in a game about proving you're not a bot. What really struck me, though, was this comment from user Tibu, who said, "It's fascinating how we're constantly reminded we're not robots, yet our lives are increasingly automated." And yeah, that hits different, doesn't it? Here we are, spending our days copying and pasting code, following algorithmic recommendations, optimizing our routines, and then we have to prove we're human by clicking on pictures of crosswalks. The technical challenges people are complaining about are pretty revealing too. Mobile users are apparently having a nightmare with the drawing challenges. Trying to draw precise shapes with your finger on a phone screen is basically impossible. And there's this whole subset of levels that require specific cultural or gaming knowledge. Like, if you've never played Minecraft, good luck with that level. Never read Where's Waldo as a kid, you're stuck. But you know what? That might be part of the point. Real CAPTCHAs often feel arbitrary and frustrating, culturally biased, inaccessible. Neil's just cranked all those problems up to 11 to make us think about them. It's interactive art that's also social commentary, wrapped up in a package that looks like a simple web game. The fact that this is getting so much traction on Hacker News, a community that usually focuses on serious tech discussions, shows there's something here that resonates. Maybe it's the shared trauma of dealing with actual CAPTCHAs, maybe it's appreciation for well-crafted web experiences, or maybe, just maybe, we all needed a reminder that proving our humanity shouldn't be this hard.
Now, if we're talking about technology that might be a solution in search of a problem, let me tell you about the ultrasonic chef's knife that's got everyone on Hacker News absolutely divided. This thing pulled in almost 500 points and nearly 300 comments. And honestly, after digging into it, I can see why people have such strong opinions.
So, Seattle Ultrasonics has just announced what they're calling the world's first ultrasonic chef's knife for home cooks. And when I say ultrasonic, I mean the blade literally vibrates at ultrasonic frequencies while you're cutting. It's like, imagine if your chef's knife had a turbo button. They're taking technology that's been used in industrial and medical applications for years, think surgical instruments and factory cutting tools, and they're putting it in your kitchen drawer. The knife itself is actually pretty impressive from a pure engineering standpoint. We're talking Japanese Sanmai AUS-10 steel, which is already premium stuff, in an 8-inch blade. But here's where it gets wild. They've integrated battery-powered ultrasonic vibrations that supposedly let the blade just glide through food with minimal force. The company claims you get these super clean cuts with way less sticking to the blade. Now, before you get too excited, let's talk about that price tag. $400. Yeah, $399 to be exact. And here's the kicker. If you order one today, you won't get it until January 2026. That's over a year away, which honestly makes me wonder if this thing is actually ready for production, or if we're basically looking at a very fancy crowdfunding campaign. The Hacker News crowd is completely split on this. You've got one camp that's genuinely impressed by the innovation. They're pointing out that people already spend hundreds on high-end Japanese knives, and at least this one does something genuinely different. There's this great comment from a user named Taek who basically says, look, people drop serious money on knife sharpening services and fancy whetstones anyway, so why are we moralizing about someone wanting to try new kitchen tech? But then you've got the skeptics, and they're raising some really valid concerns. The big one that keeps coming up is the e-waste angle. I mean, this is a knife with a battery, with electronics, with USB-C charging. What happens when that battery dies in 3 years? Do you just throw away a $400 knife? Can you even replace the battery? The company hasn't really addressed any of that. And then there are the practical questions that, honestly, as someone who cooks a lot, I'm wondering about too. Where's the power button when your hands are covered in chicken juice? How often do you need to charge this thing? Can it handle the rocking motion you use when you're mincing garlic or herbs? Like, ultrasonic vibration is great for straight cuts, but a chef's knife does so much more than just slice straight down.
One commenter made this brilliant comparison to the infamous Dropbox launch on Hacker News years ago, where everyone was like, why would anyone use this when you can just set up your own Linux server? They're saying that telling people to just sharpen your knife better is the same kind of tech bro dismissiveness. And they might have a point. Most people's knives are dull as butter knives, and if this actually solves that problem, maybe it's worth it for some folks. What really gets me thinking, though, is whether this is solving a real problem or creating a solution in search of one. Like, yes, cutting through a butternut squash or a really crusty bread can be tough with a regular knife. But is it $400 and needs charging tough? The ultrasonic tech apparently makes the blade feel almost frictionless, which sounds amazing for something like slicing sashimi or getting paper-thin tomato slices. But again, a really sharp traditional knife can do that too. The more I think about it, the more this feels like one of those products that's going to be absolutely perfect for a very specific type of person. Someone who loves kitchen gadgets, has disposable income, and gets genuinely excited about the intersection of traditional craftsmanship and modern tech. For everyone else, I don't know, maybe wait for version 2.0, or at least wait to see if they actually ship in 2026. And speaking of debates about whether new technology belongs in well-established tools, our next story is about Git introducing Rust and announcing it'll become mandatory in the build system. And wow, this one's sparking quite the debate with over 300 points and nearly 300 comments on Hacker News. Now here's where things get a bit meta and honestly kind of ironic. The actual article is behind an anti-scraping wall called Anubis that's specifically designed to keep AI bots out.
So we've got this story about open source development, about Git of all things, the tool that literally powers collaborative open source work, and it's locked behind protection that requires JavaScript and proof of work challenges to access. The admin site is basically saying AI companies have changed the social contract around how website hosting works, which, yeah, that's a whole conversation in itself about what's happening to the open web.
But let's talk about what we know from the discussion, because the community reaction here is fascinating and pretty telling. So Git, this absolutely foundational tool that's been rock solid in C for years, is proposing to bring Rust into its build system. And it's not like they're flipping a switch tomorrow. Initially, Rust would be optional, only becoming mandatory once GCC support matures. But even with that gradual approach, developers are, let's say, cautiously pessimistic at best. The portability concerns are huge here. I mean, Git runs on everything. It's one of those tools where universal availability is basically a core feature. People are pointing out that Rust doesn't play nice with platforms like Cygwin, and that's a real problem. One of Git's superpowers has always been that you can build and run it pretty much anywhere you've got a C compiler. Start requiring Rust, and suddenly you're putting off platforms that haven't caught up with Rust support yet. Then there's the complexity argument, and this one really resonates. Git contributors would now need to know both C and Rust to work on the codebase effectively. And Rust isn't exactly a weekend learn. Developers in the thread are comparing its complexity to functional programming languages. That's a pretty high barrier to entry for what's been a relatively approachable C codebase. You're essentially doubling the knowledge requirements for contribution. But what really stands out in the discussion is this fundamental question: why does Git need this at all? It's not like Git is desperately crying out for new features or struggling with memory safety issues that are causing daily problems. It's mature, it's stable, it works. Several commenters are making the comparison to the Linux kernel, where Rust makes more sense because you're constantly adding new drivers and dealing with untrusted hardware interfaces. Git doesn't have those pressures. There's this one comment that really stuck with me. Someone basically saying, maybe I'm just old and moany and need to step aside for the new generation. And you know what? That's honest. There's always this tension in tech between stability and progress, between if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and we should use better tools when they're available. The counterpoint that keeps coming up is Git Oxide. There's already a full Git implementation being written in Rust from scratch. So maybe the question isn't, should Git adopt Rust, but rather, should we just let the Rust folks build their own Git and see if it wins on merit? What's really interesting is how this mirrors broader tensions in the open source world right now. You've got established projects with decades of history trying to figure out if and how to adopt newer technologies. You've got generational divides between developers who cut their teeth on different languages, and you've got this constant push-pull between innovation and stability. The discussion thread reads like a microcosm of every rewrite it in Rust debate, except this time it's about one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure in the entire software development ecosystem. No pressure, right? And the fact that we can't even read the original announcement because of anti-AI scraping measures, there's something poetic about that, about how the open source world is getting more complicated and fragmented even as we're trying to make the tools themselves better. And that tension between innovation and stability, it's exactly what our last story grapples with, but from a completely different angle. Story 5. If all the world were a monorepo. If all the world were a monorepo grabbed 264 points and 68 comments. And honestly, after diving into it, I can see why it struck such a nerve. So here's the setup. A software engineer who cut their teeth on traditional languages like C, Java, and Lisp decides to learn R. And what they discover about R's package ecosystem completely upends their understanding of how software dependencies should work. The author describes CRAN, that's R's package manager, as essentially treating the entire R ecosystem like one giant monorepo. And before you say, wait, that's not technically a monorepo, you're right. And the comments definitely got into that distinction.
But the comparison is fascinating because of what it reveals about different philosophies in software development. Here's what makes CRAN so unusual. When you submit a package update to CRAN, it doesn't just test your code, it tests your code against multiple versions of R on different operating systems, and here's the kicker. Until 2021, it would test every single package that depends on yours to make sure you didn't break anything. We're talking potentially thousands of packages. The author shares this wild story where they got an email basically threatening to remove their package because their update broke 7 out of over 200 dependent packages. They had to coordinate fixes with maintainers they'd never even met before.
Now, if you're coming from the NPM or PyPI world, this probably sounds absolutely insane. Like, imagine if every time you wanted to update your JavaScript library, NPM said, "Hold up, we need to make sure this doesn't break any of the 10,000 packages that depend on you." The JavaScript ecosystem would grind to a halt, right? But here's the thing. The R community, especially the academic and research side, actually loves this approach. And when you think about it from their perspective, it makes sense. One commenter, 0x_BadCafeB, made this really interesting point. They said having thousands of projects stuck on older versions is a, quote, feature, not a bug. At first, that sounds backwards, but think about it. If you're a researcher running statistical analyses for a paper, the last thing you want is for your code to suddenly break because some dependency got updated. You want rock-solid stability. You want to be able to run the same analysis 5 years later and get the exact same results. But then you've got folks like UserDDIP who called the whole system unworkable and suggested the only solution is to fork everything and manage your own dependencies. And honestly, I get that frustration too. The author describes having to jump through hoops, creating workarounds and compatibility layers just to satisfy CRAN's requirements. They even mention how this system essentially forces package maintainers to be extremely conservative with updates, which, yeah, that definitely slows down innovation. What's really interesting is how this mirrors larger debates in software development. We've seen this pendulum swing between monolithic and distributed systems, between tight coupling and loose coupling. Google famously uses a massive monorepo for most of their code, while the open source world has largely embraced the opposite approach with tiny, independent packages. CRAN is trying to get the benefits of a monorepo, consistency, reliability, comprehensive testing, without actually being a monorepo. Several commenters pointed out it's more like enforced continuous integration than a true monorepo structure. The article really drives home how this affects individual developers, though. The author talks about the psychological burden of knowing that your update could break someone else's work, someone you've never met, working on a project you've never heard of. It's like, imagine if every time you pushed code, you were responsible not just for your own bugs, but for ensuring compatibility with every project that might use your code. That's a heavy responsibility.
And yet, CRAN has been doing this for decades, and R remains one of the most stable, reliable ecosystems for statistical computing. There's something to be said for that. While Python users deal with dependency hell, and JavaScript developers joke about node_modules being heavier than a black hole, R users can generally trust that if a package is on CRAN, it works, and it'll keep working. The timing of this story is interesting too, because CRAN actually relaxed these reverse dependency requirements in 2021, which suggests even they realized the approach was becoming unsustainable as the ecosystem grew. But the fact that they maintained it for so long, that's either incredibly impressive or incredibly stubborn, depending on your perspective. What really comes through in both the article and the discussion is this tension between different user bases with different needs. Software developers want to move fast, iterate quickly, try new things. Researchers and analysts want stability, reproducibility, and reliability. CRAN chose to optimize for the latter, and while that might seem crazy to those of us used to the move fast and break things mentality, it's created something unique. A package ecosystem where things just work, even if getting them to work in the first place is a massive pain for the maintainers. Thanks for joining me for this look at yesterday's top stories. I'll be back tomorrow with another selection from whatever bubbles up to the top of Hacker News. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe sharpen your regular knives just in case that ultrasonic one doesn't ship on time. This has been your Hacker News Daily Podcast. See you tomorrow.